I have told this story exactly twice in my life, once to my wife, who wept, and once to the late Duke of Marbury himself on the occasion of his youngest son's christening, when he sat back in his leather chair with a glass of brandy and said, "Bramley, you have made it considerably more romantic than it was." And I told him with complete honesty that I had made it nothing of the kind. I had only told the truth. His name, when the story begins, was Edmund Ashcroft, the fourth Duke of Marbury, a title that had been feared in 3 counties for 2 generations, and feared across London for the better part of a decade. He was not a cruel man, though many assumed so. He was a precise man. A man who did not waste words, did not smile for society's comfort, and did not suffer fools in any room he entered. I had been his closest friend since we were boys at school together, and I can tell you that beneath the iron of him there was always something else, something he had locked away so thoroughly that most people doubted it existed. I knew it existed. I had simply never expected a clergyman's widow from a snowbound coaching in to find the key. I had arrived at Marbury Hall on the 3rd of December, summoned by a letter whose terseness told me Edmund was in a state approaching fury. The Marbury estate was under legal siege. His cousin, a weasel-faced man named Clifford Ashcroft, had located a clause in the 4th Duke's inheritance documents, a clause none of us had known existed that stated the estate, and the title could only be held by a married duke, or by a duke who had been married within 2 calendar years of his predecessor's death. Edmund's father had died just over 22 months ago. Edmund had not married. Clifford had found a solicitor willing to argue the clause in a London court, and the hearing was set for the 12th of December. 9 days. I arrived at Marbury Hall to find Edmund standing before the fire in the great hall with his solicitor, a man named Greer, and the expression on Edmund's face was one I had seen perhaps 4 times in 20 years of friendship. The expression of a man who has encountered a wall he cannot simply walk through, and has not yet decided whether to go around it or demolish it. "Bramley," he said when I came through the door. "The clause is legitimate?" I asked. "Greer says so." Greer, a small, careful man, nodded once. "It is legitimate, my lord. The document is dated 1803, signed by the 2nd Duke, and has never been successfully challenged. If His Grace does not produce evidence of marriage or engagement before the court convenes on the 12th. Then Clifford gets Marbury Hall," Edmund said flatly. The room was very quiet for a moment. "Marry someone," I said. Edmund looked at me, as though I had suggested he learn to fly. "In 9 days," I said. "Find a woman willing to enter a formal engagement. Greer, would an engagement satisfy the court?" Greer considered. "A formal engagement, documented and witnessed, with a marriage contracted to follow within 60 days? Yes. I believe a skilled barrister could argue sufficiency. The clause speaks to the Duke's intention to be married. An engagement of record demonstrates that intention." "Then find someone," I said to Edmund. "A woman of good family, willing to enter a paper arrangement. You pay her generously when it dissolves." "You make it sound simple," he said. "It is simple. It is merely uncomfortable." He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the fire. Then, "And you will help me find this woman." "I will," I said, "first thing in the morning." We did not find the woman in the morning. We found her that evening, in a manner neither of us had planned, on the road between Marbury Village and the hall itself. The snow had come in hard that afternoon, the kind of December snow that does not announce itself gradually, but arrives all at once, turning the world white and silent before you have time to prepare. Edmund and I had ridden out to inspect the southern fence lines after dinner, and we were returning in the dark when we came upon a coaching inn called the Crossed Keys, lit up amber against the white, with a commotion at its front door. A woman was standing in the yard with a portmanteau at her feet, speaking to the innkeeper in a voice that was quiet and utterly composed and clearly not achieving the desired effect. The coaching connection to the next town had been cancelled. The innkeeper was explaining. The road was impassable. The last coach had already gone back to Exeter, and the inn was full. He was sorry. He could not help her. She would need to make other arrangements. She listened to all of this. Then she said, "I see." "And when you say other arrangements, you mean?" "I mean we've no room, ma'am, and I'm sorry for it." "I see," she said again. And she reached down, picked up her portmanteau without any drama at all, and looked at the white dark beyond the inn yard as though she were consulting a map that did not yet show the road she needed. Edmund had reined in without my noticing, I pulled up beside him. "She has nowhere to go," I said. "I can see that. It is below freezing." "I know, Bramley." She had set the portmanteau down again and was now speaking to the innkeeper once more, very quietly. Whatever she was saying, he was shaking his head. She nodded once, not in defeat, simply in acknowledgement, and turned away. In the lamplight I could see her clearly, a young woman, perhaps 25, in a grey wool traveling dress that had seen a great deal of service and very little expense. Her face was calm, striking in its stillness. She did not look frightened. She looked like a woman who was thinking very carefully about the next thing to do. It was Edmund who moved first. He rode forward into the yard and dismounted without ceremony. "Madam," he said. She turned. She looked at him, all of him, 6 feet of dark-haired, hard-jawed, thoroughly forbidding Edmund Ashcroft, and she did not step back. Most people stepped back. "Your Grace," said the innkeeper, startled, bowing. The woman's eyes moved from Edmund to the innkeeper and then back to Edmund. She had heard the title. Something shifted in her expression, not nerves, more like recalculation. "You are without accommodation," Edmund said. "It would appear so," she agreed. "Marbury Hall is a quarter-mile north. You may stay the night. My housekeeper will see to you." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is very kind. May I ask to whom I am speaking?" "Edmund Ashcroft, the Duke of Marbury." "Mrs. Clara Winslow," she said. She did not curtsy in the elaborate way that women sometimes did for Edmund, as though performing for him. She inclined her head with the sort of quiet precision that suggested the gesture meant something rather than nothing. "I brought her portmanteau. We rode to Marbury Hall in a procession I suspect no one would have predicted that morning." She was the widow of a clergyman named Winslow, who had died 16 months prior of a fever, leaving her with a small annuity, the clothes she stood in, and a post as a companion to an elderly woman in Bath, to which she had been traveling when the snow closed the road. She told this to Mrs. Heron, the housekeeper, and I heard it through the door of the blue sitting room where I was pretending not to eavesdrop. Her voice when she described her circumstances was the same as it had been in the inn yard, even, clear, not asking for sympathy, simply providing information. Edmund had disappeared into his study after dinner. He emerged at 10 o'clock, found me in the library, and stood in the doorway for a moment. "She is a widow," he said. "I know. A clergyman's widow. No family to speak of." "I know that, too." He was quiet. I waited. "The engagement," he said. It would be a temporary arrangement. Greer says 60 days minimum. After the court date it could dissolve quietly. I would pay her well. It would solve the situation." I looked at him very carefully. "You want to ask Mrs. Winslow. She has no connections here. She came from nowhere and is going nowhere I know of. She is a gentlewoman and a widow, not a debutante with a family who would take offense. She would be compensated. She would lose nothing." "You have thought about this very quickly," I said. "I have been thinking about nothing else for a week," he said, and she appeared. "In a snowstorm." "In a snowstorm," he agreed, without any inflection I could read. He asked her the following morning. I will say this for Edmund, he did not dissemble. He sat across from Mrs. Winslow at the breakfast table. I was present nominally as a witness, actually because I could not imagine missing it, and he laid the situation before her with complete plainness. The clause, the cousin, the hearing, the timeline, the arrangement he was proposing, 60 days minimum, then a quiet dissolution. She would be compensated to the sum he named, which was not a small sum. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And you require this engagement to be believed, not merely documented." Greer believes documentation will be sufficient for the court, but Clifford Ashcroft has men watching this house. He will look for inconsistencies. "You need it to be convincing," she said. "Yes." She looked at her teacup, then she looked at him. "I have a condition," she said. Edmund, who had not expected a condition, said nothing. "When the arrangement concludes," she said, "I would like a letter of character from you, addressed to any household I name. A duke's letter of character opens doors that a clergyman's letter does not. That is what I ask." He looked at her for a moment, then he said, "Done." "Then I accept," she said. I will confess that I sat very still at that moment, because something in that exchange, the clarity of it, The absence of performance on either side struck me as more honest than most of what passes for courtship in English society. The week that followed was the strangest and most instructive of my life. Clifford Ashcroft's solicitor arrived the following afternoon with 2 witnesses, intending to inspect the estate and interview the household, fishing for evidence that Edmund was unmarried and unengaged. Edmund greeted them in the front hall with Mrs. Winslow on his arm and introduced her as his intended, with the composure of a man reading aloud from a document he'd reviewed many times. Mrs. Winslow smiled at the solicitor with a warmth that was entirely unreadable as performance. But that was not the moment that stunned him. That moment came earlier. It came on the second morning. Edmund had taken Mrs. Winslow on a brief tour of the house, the public rooms, for plausibility's sake, so she could speak of them with familiarity, and I was following at a discreet distance when they entered the gallery. It was a long room with paintings on both walls, Ashcroft ancestors stretching back 2 centuries, and at the far end a portrait of Edmund's father, the 3rd Duke, painted in his later years with a hawk on his wrist and a look of immense satisfaction. Edmund had stopped. I could not see his face from where I stood, but I could see his shoulders, and they were doing something I did not often see them do. He was looking at the portrait, and he was very still. His father had been dead 22 months. Edmund had not, to my knowledge, spoken of him once in that time. The grief in him was not a thing he wore visibly. It was a thing he had sealed behind the iron of him and kept there, which I knew because I had been his friend long enough to understand what the sealed doors looked like. And then Mrs. Winslow, who had been walking quietly beside him and could surely see what I could see, said, in exactly the tone one uses to redirect a conversation at a dinner party when something uncomfortable has been raised, "Is that the estate at Marbury in the background? Those oaks are very fine." Edmund blinked. "Yes," he said after a moment. "My grandfather planted them." "They look like they've grown into something rather magnificent," she said. "How old are they now?" He told her. He told her about the oaks, and then about the garden in which they stood, and then about the stream at the garden's southern edge that froze every 3 years or so, and had once, when he was a boy of 8, produced a patch of ice good enough to skate on, and his father had laced his skates for him on the bank, and they had skated for the better part of an afternoon while the house watched from the windows. He did not appear to notice how much he was talking. She listened with genuine attention, asking a question here or there that was small enough not to interrupt the current. And that was that. The portrait was behind them, the moment had passed. The grief had been gently, expertly moved aside so they could walk through the room rather than stand in it. He looked at her sideways, briefly, and she was studying the next painting with a mild and genuine expression. He said nothing, but I watched his face for the rest of the gallery, and it was different than the face that had entered it. She was like that throughout the week, not performing warmth, doing it. When Mrs. Heron's rheumatism made the morning stairs difficult, Clara Winslow appeared at the bottom with an unhurried offer of assistance, entirely without condescension. When the second footman spilled an entire tray of claret at dinner, she simply reached across and blocked the spread with her napkin before it reached Edmund's papers without drawing anyone's attention to the boy. When Clifford's solicitor made a comment at dinner, on his second visit, that was designed to unsettle, a remark about the unusual speed of the engagement, with a pointed glance at Clara, she looked at the man with such serene, pleasant unconcern that he lost the thread of his own insinuation and had to start over. I watched Edmund watching her. He was not good at concealing his observations of people. Most people assumed he watched no one because his face gave so little away. But I knew what it meant when his attention fixed on something and stayed there. A man who watches like that is not watching casually. He is watching the way a person watches something that is changing the way they understand a room. On the 5th evening, he came to the library where I was reading. "She corrected Greer today," he said. "On what subject?" "The property law clause. He had the date of the precedent wrong. She corrected him." I set my book down. "Mrs. Winslow." She said her husband had argued a similar case. She said, and she was right, I checked. She said the correct precedent is from 1811, not 1814, and the distinction matters because the 1811 ruling specifically addresses estate entailment in cases of contested timing. He paused. Greer confirmed it. I said nothing, because Edmund sometimes needed space to arrive at what he was actually saying. "She knew the law," he said. "Her husband was a clergyman who clearly discussed his work with his wife," I said. She knew it better than Greer. Another pause. She said it very quietly, he said. She did not make Greer feel the correction. She mentioned it as though she were offering a footnote. Yes, I said, she does everything that way. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Bramley, this is a paper arrangement. I know, I said. It dissolves on the 13th. She goes to Bath. I know that too. He went to bed. I sat with my book and did not read it. The 7th morning was the morning she told him to stay quiet and follow her. Clifford Ashcroft himself arrived without announcement just after breakfast. He drove up in a hired coach with his solicitor and a man I did not recognize, a younger man, sharply dressed, with the look of someone carrying prepared questions. Edmund was in the study when they arrived and I was with him. We heard the carriage. Mrs. Winslow appeared in the doorway of the study before any of us had moved. She looked at Clifford through the window, and then she looked at Edmund, and I will say that what she said was the last thing any of us expected, because it was said in the tone of a woman who has already worked out the sequence of events and is simply informing the others. Stay quiet and follow me, she said. Edmund looked at her. She did not elaborate. She simply walked back into the corridor, clearly expecting to be followed. Edmund followed her. I followed both of them. She led us not toward the front hall, where Clifford was already being admitted, but toward the morning room at the east end of the house, where the table was laid for a small luncheon that Mrs. Heron had prepared for the afternoon. She rearranged 3 items on the table, moved a vase, shifted the placement of the flowers, set a second chair close to the one at the head with the rapid, quiet efficiency of someone who has managed a household without staff for a long time. Then she straightened and said to Edmund, "Sit there," and pointed at the chair she had moved close, and she sat in the other. Then she said, "When he comes in, do not stand to greet him." Edmund, who in the normal course of things did not take instructions from anyone, said, "Why not?" "Because a man at ease in his own home with his intended does not stand for a cousin who has come to harass him," she said. "He looks up, he is pleasant, he does not move. That is what a man looks like who has nothing to hide and is not impressed." Edmund was very still, and then he sat back. Clifford came in. He came in already speaking, already performing the role of the man with the upper hand, and he stopped when he saw them, Clara's hand resting on the table 3 inches from Edmund's, the ease of them, the afternoon light, the entirely mundane scene of a couple at luncheon. Edmund looked up. He was pleasant. He did not stand. "Clifford," he said, just that. The prepared questions stumbled. The solicitor behind Clifford looked at the young man with the notes, who flipped a page. Clara said, "Would you care for tea?" in the exact tone of a woman who has been making tea in this house for years and considers this a mild interruption. The interview that followed lasted 40 minutes. Clara answered every question about their engagement with the precision and calm of a woman who has never in her life been flustered, and the particular skill she brought to it was this: she did not ornament. She did not pile on details that had not been asked for, which is what people do when they are inventing. She answered what was asked and was silent, and the silence was entirely comfortable. At one point, the young man asked her to describe the morning Edmund had proposed. She looked at Edmund, and Edmund looked at her, and there was a beat, just half a second, that I cannot explain even now, because whatever passed between them in that half second was not nothing. "It was December," she said. "It was snowing." He was very direct. She paused. "I did not expect it." "And you accepted at once?" the young man asked. "No," she said. "I had a condition." The young man looked up from his notes. "Any woman who accepts a duke's proposal without a condition," she said pleasantly, "is not thinking clearly." Clifford's solicitor made a note. The young man almost smiled. Edmund, I noticed, was looking at the table, and the corner of his mouth had done something I could not quite read. Clifford left without what he'd come for. When the carriages had gone from the drive, Edmund and Clara sat for a moment in the morning room, and the quiet between them was the particular quiet of people who have just come through something together and are still breathing. Then Edmund said, "The condition." "I mentioned it," she said. "You said it in front of Clifford's man." "Yes." He looked at her. "You wanted him to know." "I wanted him to know I am not a woman who was dazzled," she said. "A woman who was dazzled is a woman who can be unsettled. I am not that." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "No, you are not." The days that remained before the court date were different. Not in their arrangement, the arrangement was the same. Greer was still preparing documents. The situation had not changed. But something had shifted in the house, in the way of the mornings, in the rhythm of the evenings. They took to walking in the garden after dinner, even in the cold, and I did not follow them. I watched them from the library window on 2 of those evenings, not prurience friendship. I was watching to understand what I was witnessing. They walked without great speed, talking. Clara had a particular habit of speaking with her hands when she was making a point, not grandly, just a small clarifying gesture that said the thing her voice was also saying. Edmund walked with his hands at his sides in the way of a man who has always held himself very still. But I noticed, on the second evening, that he had stopped doing that. His hands were in the pockets of his coat, which was not precisely relaxed, but it was something. Mrs. Heron, who was not a sentimental woman, made her observations known to me through the language of sighs at breakfast. I made no comment. The night before the hearing, I found Edmund in the library again. Late, past 11. He was sitting at the desk with a letter open in front of him and a pen in his hand, but he was not writing. The fire had burned low and the room was cold at the edges, warm only where the lamplight fell, and he looked like a man who had been sitting in the same position for a long time and had not noticed. "The letter of character," he said when I came in. "I thought I might draft it." I sat down across from him. I did not take the chair opposite immediately. I poured myself a small glass from the decanter on the side table because I suspected the conversation would require it, and then I sat. "She will go to Bath," he said. "A companion's post. The woman she mentioned is an invalid elderly. The work will be small and the pay will be adequate, and it is a long way from—" He did not finish the sentence. "From here," I said. "From here." I said nothing for a moment. Then I said, "Edmund, the clause requires evidence of intent to marry within 60 days. It does not require you to dissolve the engagement after 60 days. He was very still. "I am not proposing anything," I said. "I am only pointing out that the document Greer is filing states a marriage to follow within 60 days. It does not say the engagement must end." He looked at the pen in his hand. "She agreed to a paper arrangement," he said. "She agreed to leave." "She agreed to leave if the arrangement concluded," I said. "Those are not the same." He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the fire burned lower, and neither of us added wood. Then he said, "She does not want a duke." "You have no idea what she wants," I said. "You have not asked her." He looked at me. "She told Clifford's man she is not a woman who is dazzled," I said. "She did not say she is a woman who is unmoved." He went to bed. I stayed by the fire because there was nothing else to do. The hearing on the 12th was brief. Greer was thorough, the documentation was in order, and Edmund's barrister was considerably better than Clifford's. The clause was satisfied. The estate was secure. Clifford sat at the back of the courtroom with the expression of a man recalculating. On the carriage ride back to Marbury Hall, Edmund sat with his hat on his knee and said nothing for 12 miles. I knew better than to fill the silence. At mile 13, he said, there was a moment in the gallery. "I know," I said. "She knew what she was doing." "Yes. She did it without thinking about it. It was entirely natural to her." "Edmund," I said. "What?" "Tell me what you said to her in the garden on Tuesday evening. I saw you stop under the east oak. You were speaking. She looked at you. You were there for 20 minutes. He was very quiet. Then he said, "I told her that the oaks were older than the house, that my grandfather had planned the garden to outlast the building." "That is not what I am asking." He looked out the window. "I told her I wished the week were not ending." "And what did she say?" The carriage turned onto the Marbury Road. The hall came into view ahead, lamplight in the windows, the oak he'd mentioned stark against the gray sky. "She said she wished so too," he said. I nodded once. "It is insufficient," he said, "as a declaration." "Perhaps ask her for a more specific one," I said. He looked at me, and something happened in his face, something I had not seen there in years. Something that had been locked away, carefully and for a long time, and that was now, in the rocking carriage on the Marbury Road, tentatively reconsidering its position. He found her in the morning room. She was packing, not with drama, with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything. The portmanteau was open, and she was folding a gray wool dress with the careful attention of a woman who owns two and intends both to survive the next decade. He stood in the doorway. She turned. "The hearing was successful?" she asked. "It was." "Good." She turned back to the dress. He said, "Mrs. Winslow." She was still. "Clara." She turned fully. Her face was composed, the way it had been in the inn yard when she'd picked up the portmanteau and faced the dark and the cold and calculated the next thing to do. It was not blank. It was the face of a woman who is being careful. "The arrangement has concluded," he said. "Yes," she said. "I owe you a letter of character." "Yes." He was quiet. She waited. "I would like to offer you a different arrangement," he said. She did not move. 60 days, he said. "Not a letter of character, an actual engagement, a real one, to be followed at whatever interval you require by an actual marriage." He paused. "I am aware that is not what you agreed to. I am aware you came here with a purpose and that purpose is met and you have no obligation to hear this. I am also aware that this is—" He stopped. He was not, in the ordinary course of things, a man who ran out of words. "I am not given to sentiment," he said. "I have been told so reliably for most of my adult life. But I have spent a week in this house watching you move through it as though you had always belonged here, and I find I cannot imagine you packing that portmanteau and disappearing down the Exeter Road, and I would like, very much, for you to stay." The room was entirely quiet. Clara Winslow set the gray dress down on the top of the portmanteau. She looked at it for a moment, then she looked at him. "That was considerably more," she said, "than I expected." "I have been told my expectations of myself are low," he said. Something moved across her face that I would not presume to describe more precisely than this. It was the expression of a woman who has been keeping a very careful account of what she does and does not have, and has just been shown that the accounting was incomplete. "I have a condition," she said. He held very still. "I will not be a society duchess," she said. "I do not know how to perform that particular role and I have no interest in learning it. I will be your wife. I will manage this house, and I will keep your company, and I will correct your solicitors when they have the wrong precedent. I will sit beside you at dinner, and I will walk in your garden, and I will not, under any circumstances, let you stand in that gallery staring at your father's portrait without someone to redirect you to the Oaks." She paused. "If those terms are acceptable." He said, "Those terms are more than acceptable." "Then I accept," she said. The word was the same as the one she had used 7 days before, when he had offered her 60 days and a letter of character. But it was a wholly different word. She did not move toward him. He did not move toward her. But the distance between them in that morning room, with the portmanteau open on the table and the gray dress folded on top of it, and the lamps lit against the December afternoon, was different than it had been a moment before, smaller, warmer, already beginning to feel like the distance between two people who know they will have time to close it. I am told that when she wrote to cancel the companion's post in Bath, she did so in a single sentence, and that the letter contained no explanation whatsoever. I believe it. The wedding was in February, when the Oaks were bare but the first snowdrops had come up along the east garden wall, and Edmund stood at the altar of Marbury Church with the expression of a man who has come to the end of a very long walk, and finds that the place he has arrived at is better than any place he had previously imagined. Clara came up the aisle in a pale blue wool dress, not white, not silk, entirely sensible, entirely her. And she looked at him with the same clear composure she had brought to the inn yard and the gallery and the morning room, except that her eyes, when she reached him, were very bright. Clifford Ashcroft was not in attendance. I was. I stood to Edmund's left and watched the two of them, and I thought of the inn yard in the snow, and the portmanteau, and the half-second in the morning room when she had said it was snowing and he had been very direct, and the oak trees Edmund's grandfather had planted to outlast the house. They outlasted a great deal more than that, in the end. The fourth Duke of Marbury was, in the years that followed, not a softer man, but he was a clearer one. He laughed more than he had. He walked in the garden in all weathers. He corrected his own solicitors before they had the chance to get things wrong, which Greer found useful and slightly unnerving. And whenever anyone in those years described him to a newcomer as the ruthless Duke of Marbury, the cold, the feared, the iron, he would wait until he had the opportunity, and then he would simply say, You should meet my wife. It was always enough.